Good morning. Today we look at 2 Samuel 19 and 20. And then tomorrow we will combine Sunday's readings in. So tomorrow we will finish 2 Samuel. Yeah. And in chapter 19 today, it begins with, it was told to Joab. Yesterday Joab and his army had defeated Absalom and his army, and Absalom, King David's son, had been killed, and King David is mourning. He is deeply grieved, and it causes discontent with the soldiers. It says, the soldiers snuck into town as ones who had been, as if they were ashamed and had lost the battle, because they understood, they realized that David was mourning and so much pain for the death of his son. And it says, the king covered his face and cried out, oh my son, and I understand totally, King David's position as to mourning the death of his son. But Joab realizes the effect that is having upon the army. And that he comes to King David, and Joab is probably one of the few that could come to King David and say, what you're doing is you're making every soldier, feel second guessing, what they're doing by mourning the death of your son so much. Not that there's anything totally wrong with that, but, he said the morale of the troops is just, it's in the tank. And he says, you've got to change. You've got to get up and change this, because if you keep going the way it is, it's only going to get worse. So the king ceased his mourning, King David did. And he got up in verse 8, and it says he got up and sat at the gate, and then all the troops came before him. And so this was kind of took some of the bitter edge off of the troops' feelings that way. The Israelites had, it says they fled to their homes, and it's still kind of northern kingdom of Israel and southern kingdom of Judah. And, and this is, so King David has been in Judah, and then it's, you need to return to Jerusalem and take your rightful place as king again. And, he does that, but in the meantime, he's upset with Joab for Joab's honesty with him about what was going on. And King David makes, Amasa, the commander of the armies. And again, that doesn't sit real well with Job, and there's conflict there. But there's so much stuff that's going on. And then when we get to verse 16, Shimei, that guy that was throwing rocks and hurling insults, this descendant of King Saul, comes and, some of them, we got to put him to death because of his insubordination, because of his, because of what he was doing. And King David says, no, we've had enough killing. He will be forgiven, and so we see some of that good grace coming in there as well. And, when he comes, he pleads to Shimei, he says, may the Lord not hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on that day. He admits his wrong, he admits what he did, and he asks in that way for forgiveness and to be able to then go on living. In verse 23, as I mentioned, the king says to Shimei, you will not die. And the king gave him his oath, a promise that he would be saved that way. Then, verse 24, Mephibosheth, this grandson of Saul, the son of David with the crippled feet, comes. And, he had not been taking care of himself while the King David was gone, but evidently he cleaned himself up and came then to the king. and there's conflict between Mephibosheth and his servant Ziba, and they're both wanting the land, and it's just kind of more of that intrigue going on. It's just so much stuff behind the scenes, and more things that the king has to deal with, and everybody else has to deal with as well. But this Mephibosheth says to the king, "What right have I to appeal to the king?" And the king's decision is that Mephibosheth and Ziba should divide the land of Saul, so that they would, and Mephibosheth said, just let him take it all, since my king has come home, and then this Mephibosheth lives in David's court and is taken care of that way. And meanwhile, there's a guy named Barzillai, a very aged man. He says 80 years old, and I thought, an aged man. That's getting pretty close. But anyway, he provided the king with food, and King David says, why don't you come and be in Jerusalem, and I'll provide for you. And he says, I'm 80 years old. How many years have I got left? I would just as soon stay here and be where I am. And so he does that. And then in verse 41, it says that all the people of Israel came to David as king. So again, it sounds like a united kingdom. However, there's still friction. And when we get to chapter 20, it says, now a scoundrel, somebody that's against David, anyway, son of Berchi, a Benjaminite, shouts out, we have no portion with David, and he wants that separation. He doesn't want to be under David's rule. And so the people of Israel, the northern kingdom, kind of, again, withdraw from King David, but the people of Judah remain in David's camp. They are they look at him as their king. And then in verse 4, the king says to Amasa, and then remember, this is the new commander appointed over Joab because of David's displeasure with Joab for his honesty, and also that